Last year, we initiated a new section of the conference devoted to important aspects that connect Detroit to the study of citizenship. And it was extremely successful last year. And this year, as I was talking to Shirley a few minutes ago, what else could be the Detroit topic this year but the bankruptcy? And I want to thank my friend and co-conspirator and collaborator, Amy Bloom, the social studies consultant for Oakland Schools, for helping to put together a terrific panel today. And we're really honored to have it moderated by Nathan Bomey, who covered the bankruptcy for the Free Press and just shared in a major award for his coverage of the bankruptcy. So the panel is in very good hands, and I'm going to hand it over to him. So thank you, Nathan.
So, no, it's great to be here, and I really appreciate the chance to do this. My name is Nathan Bomey, like you said, and I was the lead reporter on Detroit's bankruptcy for the Free Press, which is the biggest newspaper in Michigan, obviously the biggest thus in Detroit as well. And so you can find our content at freep.com. And, you know, the bankruptcy was really an incredible process, regardless of how you view it, whether you view it as an outstanding outcome for the city or, you know, or the last straw in the city's decline. You know, it really was an incredible process to see up close. The one thing I wonder if our panel can talk a little bit about, at least a couple of our folks who are really in the middle of it, is how busy this process was over the last 2 years and how much it absorbed everyone's lives. So now that it's over, we have a little bit of a chance to reflect, I think, maybe now, and discuss some of these issues. But I just want to have each of the panelists just briefly introduce themselves and tell us maybe why they're here. So,
I'm Peter Hammer. I direct the Damon J. Key Center for Civil Rights here at Wayne State. And I had a big part in at least applying for the job of being the expert witness to evaluate the feasibility of the bankruptcy plan of adjustment.
Good afternoon. I'm Sheila Cockrel. I'm a retired member of the Detroit City Council. I spent 16 years on the City Council and left in 2009 because I knew what was coming, and I knew there was not the political will, courage, or capacity on the council at that time to take the actions that were needed. Lifelong Detroiter, and we are on the comeback.
I'm Laura Trudeau. I'm the leader of the Detroit program at the Kresge Foundation, which is a large national foundation that has a particularly strong commitment to its hometown of Detroit. I was involved in the bankruptcy as part of the team that helped to define the kind of legal requirements, even though I'm not an attorney. They always used to say to me that after I was done with this, I could play an attorney on television. But I tended at times to bring the non-attorney perspective to the discussions, and I found it fascinating and rewarding to be part of it, and a relief when it ended. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shirley Lightsey. I am the president of the DRCEA, which is the Detroit Retired City Employees Association. I've been involved with that organization for 28 years because I retired just 29 years ago, okay? I also was appointed by the Justice Department as one of the official retirees on the committee for the retirees during the bankruptcy. And yes, the bankruptcy did take over my life, along with this young man sitting next to us. I mean, there were weeks that we were working 7 days a week on the telephone, on the computer, trying to have everything right so when we went to court, everything was okay. Yes, it affected my life. 18 months that I gave up, didn't do anything but bankruptcy proceedings. And December the 10th, when it stopped, I had withdrawal symptoms, and I'm not joking. I really had withdrawal symptoms, so I know what it's like when somebody is taken off of medication or whatever, because there was a nervousness there because I had too much time. And my body, really, my body had geared up to run 7 days a week. So that was the end effect of the bankruptcy for me.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Pletcha. I'm a partner at Lippitt O'Keefe Gornbein. I was counsel for the DRCEA, which Shirley is the president of, as well as the RDPFFA, which is the Retired Detroit Police and Firefighters Association. Both presidents were also on the official committee of retirees. I was their counsel 24/7, and Shirley is here to let you know that that's true. Shirley is the epitome of what it means to be a citizen with all of her volunteer efforts, so I'm glad to be sitting next to her today. The Detroit bankruptcy process was about as multifaceted as a problem can be. There was litigation, there was mediation, there was campaigning, there was education. It was truly a microcosm of citizenship in one contained unit, but it was also very heartening to see the community come together the way that it did, because the way the city felt the first day I was down here for the bankruptcy case compared to the last day, the energy and the feeling in the city is totally different. So I was pleased to be part of the process and to help protect retirees from what could have been exponentially worse harm.
That's actually a perfect segue into where I wanted to start. So on July 18th, 2013, the city of Detroit filed for bankruptcy, cited about $18 billion in debt and liabilities. That included $11 or $12 billion in unsecured debt, meaning about 1/3 of it was related to water and sewer debt, things that could not really be cut. The rest of it was either retiree liabilities, which would be pensions, or health care promises that were made over the course of the last few decades and had stacked up and and basically were consuming a massive portion of the city's budget. So the city of Detroit, on the day it filed for bankruptcy, was paying about 4 out of 10 of its dollars to retiree liabilities or to bank debt. So in other words, 4 out of $10 off the top were going to service these sort of legacy costs, is a phrase you might hear, meaning they only had 60% of their budget to spend on things like police and fire and basic city services that you would consider to be standard in most cities. So that is a very simple explanation of where the city's finances were when they filed for bankruptcy, but the projections showed that they'd get to about 70% of their costs would be spent on those, of their budget would be spent on those costs within 5 or 6 years. So by about 2020, the city would have been spending about 7 out of 10 of its dollars on those things versus only 3 out of 10 of its dollars on services. And as we all know, and I think we'll discuss a little bit, the city's budget is already very small. They don't have much money to deal with to begin with. Why? Because of the things I think you've discussed over the last few hours and days, the fact that the city of Detroit has declined significantly from its peak in the 1950s, and so we can talk a little bit about that. But the revenue, so what I've heard people say the city of Detroit has a revenue problem, not a debt problem. And there's other people who would say the city has a debt problem, not a revenue problem. Okay, well, the answer is both. The city had a revenue problem and a debt problem, and that was shown pretty clear in the bankruptcy. So I do want to start with Shirley, though, because Shirley has such a unique perspective on this case. You have lived in Detroit for your whole life and you graduated from Cass Tech High School, and then so to see the city at its peak like you did, and then to be experiencing this process where we had to deal with the consequences of the last 50 or 60 years, what was that like for you?
Well, I've told everyone else, in May I'll be 81. So that means that I have been in Detroit since 1930, whatever. And to have lived through the highlights and the best of the city of Detroit, and to see the city of Detroit as it is now, or was 6 months ago, because it is improving, it's quite a dramatic change. And knowing, in fact, I just gave him an article that was in the paper about a month ago. When I was growing up and World War II came, it is quite evident that without the city of Detroit, who already had automated systems to make tanks and airplanes and whatever, I don't think the United States would have won World War II. I tell people all the time that, we were that great, and I have always looked at it as being that great. I went, like I said, all of my schooling has been in the city of Detroit, and it's been the best of Wayne State, the best of Cass Tech, all of them. So to see the city and to work and see what has happened, just like my department, Water and Sewage Department, it's not the department that I retired from. To see things diminish to the point that they've diminished, because I did a chart about 3 years ago that showed from 1910 through census to 2010, the dramatic decline of the population. And my question was, wasn't anyone checking that, you know, like every 10 years? Because now it has affected the retirees who were promised, and that was it. Most of what they are talking about, they were promised, and I was right in there with them in the beginning because I was ready to fight to the end to keep what we had. But after seeing all the presentations and seeing exactly where the city was, and it took them about 6 months to find out where the money really was, okay? It was that confusing. There wasn't anything that we could do except join in so that the city could survive. Because I have to say to retirees, and I know that there are many of them that don't agree with me, they're mad at me, but why are we here? If the city of Detroit dies, what good is it going to do anyone? You know, it's more than them. They were a creditor. We didn't realize we'd be creditors in a bankruptcy. I mean, 10 years ago, if someone had told me that, I would say, a bankruptcy? What? We did not believe it. We had promises when we were hired that we would have a certain health care when we retired. We would have levels of pensions when we retired. Well, that did not happen. And many of them understand why, and many of them are still fighting. And everyone makes their own decision, and if they want to fight, that's fine. And if they succeed, that's fine, because really I think the only thing that they will succeed in would possibly be the 4.5 and maybe something in addition. But to have some of the attitudes that we have seen in the last month or so, it's mind-boggling. My recommendation to anyone who has students for the citizenship, or I don't know what they call, we used to call it government classes. They're called different classes now all over, I'm pretty sure, the world. But I think my one caution would be that they be taught to check for themselves, not rely on other people to give them information. Be independent. It's just like some people built storm cellars and bomb shelters. We have to have a shelter for everything in our life that we consider important. And your health care is important, and how you can pay your bills and how you make your bills is important. So that is my advice to all children in the United States, and I have been told there are many from other countries, and I don't know how things are done in your country, but I do think that each individual has got to understand that they are responsible for their destiny. And we start in school. So
let's start. And I'm really glad you made those points, because I want to go back to that later too and talk a little bit about the resolution of the bankruptcy and how it ended for retirees, how it ended for the banks, how it ended for citizens. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I want to also take it back just to the very basics of it, which is, what does bankruptcy mean for a city, for a United States municipality? Chapter 9 bankruptcy is what they call it in America, so that's different than a corporate bankruptcy where corporations can reorganize their debt, cut debt, and then reemerge as a better company, or Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which is where you liquidate, you sell all your assets, and you go out of business. What does Chapter 9 bankruptcy mean for a city? Peter, maybe you can start us off on your perspective on what Chapter 9 bankruptcy means.
Complicated. I don't pretend to be the bankruptcy expert, so I don't want to oversell my credentials. But I will say one important difference about Chapter 9. Chapter 9 anticipates that a city will be a living, viable entity at the end of it, and that is not the objective or the criteria for so many other bankruptcies, of which a liquidation of somebody's assets or a corporate entity could be in there. And that means that there was one question within the context of the bankruptcy that did make it interestingly different, and that was a question of feasibility. Right? Is the plan of adjustment feasible? Which at least I translate into the notion, does it leave enough of a living, breathing city left for that city to be sustainable? And one of my critiques of the plan of adjustment and the report that was done by Martha Kovacs was that what we are doing through Chapter 9 and what we're doing through receivership in other cities, and there's probably about 30 cities in the country that have gone through this, we're producing what a scholar at Stanford Law School calls minimal cities, right? So cities that go through bankruptcy, Chapter 9, that go through receivership, are stripped down to very fundamental bare-bone services that they provide. At the end of the day, there's usually a planning function, although apparently even our planning function in Detroit may not necessarily be public, or as public as we might want it to be. There is police and there's fire, right? And at least in Detroit, there's a bulldozer department which is supposed to be attacking the issue of blight. What there isn't is investment in social services, right? And if you think about the Kerner Commission report, which was produced in 1968 at the end of the civil unrest, they warned, sort of prophesized against moving to a society that was black and white, segregated and separate and unequal. And if you take seriously this notion of minimal cities, what we're doing through Chapter 9, and it's no fault of the judge, it's the law. So I'm not saying that this is a bankruptcy problem gone awry. This is the logical application of bankruptcy to cities that are in distress. And cities in distress in the United States are poor by definition, almost, although some get there by other sets of problems, and more often than not, majority minority. Right? And so what we're doing now through Chapter 9 and through the bankruptcy is creating these minimal cities which are going to be largely people of color. Right? And one of my other critiques of this is that we look at the city as the appropriate unit. Right? And again, that's the legal unit. That's the proper legal outcome and application. But cities and boundaries are imaginary lines, right? That could be drawn and redrawn and have been redrawn many times. And if we look at Detroit in isolation, we see an opportunity desert, right? If you look at Detroit in the context of the region, you see that we are sitting in a fairly wealthy region, right? And if you redraw the frame as a regional frame and ask what is your community, who is your brother, what is your obligation, you don't have the social triage logic which is behind Chapter 9. Right? So I come at these largely from structural perspectives, which means that I can be very friendly with individuals. It's not attacking an individual, critiquing an individual. It's really saying, are we getting at the root structural problems? And Chapter 9 just wasn't designed to do that, which means that the root structural problems that led to the population decline, that led to the financial distress, are really only marginally addressed in the context of the plan of adjustment.
Ryan, I mean, you live bankruptcy, and obviously this is the first municipal bankruptcy you were involved in, as it was most of all the attorneys in this case. So what was it like? What does Chapter 9 bankruptcy mean to you as a bankruptcy professional?
It means a lot of things, and I understand what Peter's saying about the systems and the structure in which Chapter 9 unfolded in the city of Detroit. But the plan of adjustment, and in a Chapter 9 case, only the city can present a plan. Other creditors, social groups can't say, well, this may be good, but this is better. And that's not ultimately what the judge had to decide. He had to decide whether under this plan, the city could pay its debts. And that's a very simplistic way of talking about feasibility, but that's essentially what it is. Is there going to be a Chapter 18, which is a euphemism for the second Chapter 9? So that's really what the judge is looking at, is will this get repeated? And that's really, it's a budget, it's dollars, it's cents. Unfortunately, it doesn't redress all of the issues that got Detroit where it was. And likely no plan could. We were in and out of bankruptcy in less than 16 months. I don't see how all of these systems, structures, ill feelings could have been corrected in that short of a period of time, and maybe even 5 to 10 times as long as that could that have been redressed. But I don't think in this situation the perfect should have became the enemy of the good. In this case, is it the best scenario that could have unfolded? I don't know. Is it something that's feasible, that protects retirees and the clients that I represented, and is providing better services than what citizens had before? I believe the answer to that is yes.
Sheila, you said something very interesting earlier, that you left in 2009, you could sort of see what was coming, and there was not the political will to deal with these issues. Just maybe you could expound on that. What did you mean by that, and what was it like for you to see bankruptcy happen a few years after you left the council?
Well, I chaired the Budget, Finance, and Audit Standing Committee for the last 4 years. So as it became clearer and clearer really in the last 8 years that we were using credit cards to pay credit cards to pay credit cards, it raises one of the key points I want to make that really doesn't get discussed a lot. There's a ton of kicking the can down the road. When the Free Press did its phenomenal series, it showed all these mayors. There should have been pictures of every single governor and every single state treasurer and every single captain of industry, because the core problem in the city, yes, there was bad management, there was corruption, there's all of those things. The core problem in the city is disinvestment. There is a one-to-one correlation between Oakland County's wealth and Detroit's poverty. The tax base up and moved. You want to see the poster child for that? Look at Highland Park. I know you're not from here, but you may have been there. Highland Park, Michigan, and Auburn Hills, Michigan. Chrysler Corporation's world headquarters was in Highland Park. It was a viable inner ring suburb. It literally was a bedroom community to the city, filled with faculty from Wayne State, all kinds of folks. They took the tax base and went out to Auburn Hills. It is today a train wreck of a community. So there are issues that have to be resolved, but the fundamental structural problem that the mayor and the city council and the captains of industry and the philanthropic community are all addressing, and I will say this, in my 61 years, first time I've seen it actually be an actively engaged question: how do we rebuild Detroit's economy? Because without a tax base, we're rearranging, once again, the deck chairs on the Titanic. I spent the last 4 years saying, we're on the Titanic, we're rearranging the deck chairs, the Titanic has hit the iceberg, we've broken in two, and we're still selling revenue anticipation notes and tax anticipation notes when we know we can't pay them. We're still being asked by retirees for increases in benefits when we haven't made the annual contribution that we were supposed to make. We're still, as council, talking about the important safety net function of city government and how we have to put resources into those kinds of services, which I fundamentally and truly believe, but you can't have a safety net if you don't have a tax base. That's what I learned in 16 years.
Yeah. Laura, the nonprofit community, also was dramatically impacted by the bankruptcy, and Kresge has been a major investor in Detroit. So what does bankruptcy do when the city files for bankruptcy, and how did that affect the way Kresge viewed Detroit and its role in helping Detroit recover?
Well, I think for a long time we could see that the population decline and the economic decline of Detroit were harmful. And we really saw it in the same way Sheila did, that the tax base and the population were moving. We made a lot of efforts to kind of try to stop sprawl. We looked at policy solutions. We looked at, we did a lot of work to try to improve the educational system in Detroit, because that was one of the drivers of people moving out of the city. We were starting to see some progress. The decade from 1990 to 2000 was actually the first time that the poverty rate dropped in the city of Detroit. So that, you can attribute that to good policies out of Washington. It was a growth period. But we were starting to feel as though there were ways to rebuild the city that wouldn't require the kind of deep, deep subsidy that has been required for years, either through federal funding or foundation money or corporate giving. There was, you can go back to UDAG when the federal government decided that there were cities that they really needed to invest in, globally important cities that were not going to come back, and Detroit was one of those. So this is a problem that really, as Shirley said, has gone on for a long time. And the foundations were really afraid that when the foreclosure crisis came, that we would not be able to recover. So that kind of set the ground for our reaction during the period of bankruptcy. We had continued to invest heavily. The foundation I worked for tripled its investment between 2006 and now, trying to stabilize the conditions, physical, social, and economic conditions in the city. But it wasn't enough. Our resources weren't enough. Our foundation is worth more than $3 billion because of the fact that it's 90 years old, and our founder, who had given $60 million, it's grown to $3 billion now. But even that would not be enough. So how would we be able to engage with others to solve some of the core fundamental problems preventing some of the foreclosures that were going on, restoring neighborhoods, rebuilding the downtown so that we had an economic core that could produce revenue for the rest of the city. All those pieces were in this kind of suite of investments that we had made and were monitoring and adding to. And then all of a sudden, we thought that there would be this free fall through bankruptcy. We were afraid that it would take a long time to resolve the bankruptcy, and that all the badly needed investment would not be able to come in because no one would be able to engage in a city that, its future was uncertain. So I think our point of view was that in order to continue to protect the fabric of the city and the quality of life for residents, we needed to really get involved in a much deeper way, and that's why the foundation community came together with a number of others to create something that was called the Grand Bargain. People wanted to characterize it as about the art, about the pensions. In many ways, it was about both of those things. We were very concerned about the people who had worked for the city for so many years and had that promise of a pension who were going to lose it. And we were hearing numbers like, 40% cut. What was it, Shirley?
31 and went down to 27.
Yeah.
We don't know what it would have really been.
And we could just imagine people, living in really desperate circumstances who had been working all their lives for the city. We also thought that it would be harmful not only to the reputation of the city to lose its art museum, but harmful to the legacy on which to rebuild the city. But our main concern was with the speed of resolution of the bankruptcy so that we could get to the point where we would begin to build again. So I don't know if that's responsive, Nathan, but that's kind of, I'm only really speaking for the Kresge Foundation, but I know that those feelings were shared by a lot of our colleagues in other foundations. The leader of one of the other larger foundations said, we have to embrace our shared fate. The foundations have to look with all the other people in Detroit and embrace our shared fate and realize that the destiny of the city really does rely on us acting together for the benefit of the people.
She mentioned the Detroit Institute of Arts, which I know that some of you are going to visit after this panel is over, and that's terrific because we'll talk about how the Detroit Institute of Arts became critical to the outcome of the bankruptcy and also how it was potentially on its deathbed at one point. So that's a fascinating story. We're going to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about democracy. And Detroit's bankruptcy really raises fundamental issues about what does democracy mean. Because we have a process in the state of Michigan called an emergency management process, which the state of Michigan has imposed for municipalities that are struggling financially, that can no longer pay their bills or are headed down the path toward not being able to afford their bills. And so what happened in this city of Detroit, just to give you a very brief background, is that the governor of the state of Michigan, Rick Snyder, who is a Republican, appointed Kevin Orr, who is a bankruptcy attorney, very high-profile bankruptcy attorney from a firm called Jones Day. These are people who get paid $1,000 an hour for their processes, to basically come into the city of Detroit and take over the government. So Kevin Orr became the government in the city of Detroit. The city council was more or less powerless. The mayor was effectively powerless. And so although they did have a role of sorts, and we're not going to get into the details, but the bottom line is that Kevin Orr controlled the finances and he controlled the future of the city. And of course, from a political perspective, you could argue he needed to defer somewhat to the elected officials, but for all intents and purposes, he did control the future of the city. So, and he is the one who recommended the bankruptcy and ended up leading the bankruptcy in the city of Detroit. He is gone now. He just left a few months ago. And the city is back to local control, albeit with an oversight board that was also imposed by the state. So I want to ask just a very basic question for our folks, and I'll throw it out there. Was democracy suspended in Detroit when the governor appointed an emergency manager? Sheila?
I don't think you can conclude anything but it was.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the core definition of what an emergency manager is, which is the suspension of democracy. And let me tell you sort of two ways that that affected the bankruptcy. I think one positive in terms of the role that Judge Rhodes played, and one negative if I harp on my feasibility and city services. I was interviewed to be one of the experts to assess the feasibility, and it was very clear to me as you're getting questions, not from just from the judge, but from the participants, nobody there was representing the citizens. Right? And when I've been advocating throughout this process about needing more services, worried about the cuts, having more there, that comes at a zero-sum game. Because if there's more that is reserved for the city services, that's coming out of pensioners' pockets, that's coming out of creditors' pockets. And so if you don't have somebody at the table actually looking out for that interest, and there wasn't in a democratically elected way, everybody else wants to sort of see those be as small as possible to get through feasibility, right? So I think that this dynamic of not having democratically elected governance made it even harder to be advocating strongly for the robustness of services that some people might think needed to exist to really be feasible, right? Just one other short thing. Because of the lack of democracy, I also think it created a huge question of legitimacy for the entire bankruptcy plan and bankruptcy process. And I think what you saw, and this is pretty clear in his post-retirement interviews, Judge Rhodes was very sensitive to that. And a lot of what Judge Rhodes did in the process of bankruptcy was intended to try to sustain the legitimacy of the bankruptcy process, the degree to which he let citizens testify, the patience which he had for those issues, his willingness to indulge an expert like me to talk about social policy and not necessarily Chapter 9. So I think that as a result of it, Judge Rhodes really, in some respects, came to the rescue in conducting the bankruptcy process in a way that preserved the legitimacy of it when it was being pushed by an emergency manager who is, by definition, undemocratic.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah, I have a slightly different take on it. I mean, the right to vote is absolutely a critical, essential American value and a cornerstone of democracy, but also is the basic right to life and liberty and pursuit of happiness. And if you're living in a city where your police department doesn't come and you are literally hiding behind closed doors with a gun because you're a senior citizen and the lights are out, where's your right to safety? Where's your right to being able to cut your grass without having somebody come up with a weapon and take your lawnmower from you and threaten your life? I mean, there was a decay, a cancerous decay in the capacity of the city to provide its core function to keep a viable democracy, fundamental services. And that's what, in my view, wasn't being addressed. And yes, a tough call had to get made. Do those rights supersede the right to have a group of people sit at a table or sit in a mayor's office and continue to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic? That's what was going on. And the political will and the political courage that it would have taken to institute some of the discussion, let alone the required enormous painful sacrifice, elected politicians aren't going to do. First of all, if you run for a local office, you're running to help people. So it's antithetical to the idea of helping to say, excuse me, city worker, you're about to get your pay, your pay is slashed, your working conditions are changing, and your pension's out the window. That's really hard to do. That was the only solution, short of some fundamental restructuring of American capitalism to redefine the nature of how the economy would work. That, in my opinion, ain't happening anytime soon. Therefore, you got to make the best of it. So yes, the right to vote, for democratic right to vote, in fact, have elected people speak for you, was not there, but it couldn't be there because everybody then would have had the democratic experience of being in the first above ground Pompeii in the world. The city would have been dead.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on the democracy question?
I would just say that we were observers in this situation as foundations. We're not allowed to be political per se, but we did feel that it was a matter of two really difficult choices. And whenever you're in a situation with difficult choices, something is going to be sacrificed, and it really was that right to vote. We were thankful that it was as short as it was. I guess that's the best we could say. But we were not we never felt that it was a good thing for emergency management to come in, but it did seem to us at the time to be a necessary response to the deep crisis of the city. Not just the financial crisis, but as Sheila says, the life sustenance within the city.
How did I personally feel? I felt that we were occupied by a foreign land. And Jones Day and group, even though they said Kevin Orr, they were the foreign city government, because when they spoke of the city, they were speaking of people that we didn't know. I was used to our council and our mayor that we had campaigned for and talked with and knew, because they had the same backgrounds that we had in the city. So yes, we did feel as if we were being occupied instead of the bankruptcies that we had heard going through the other cities. I want to say one thing about the City of Detroit retirees. When I had to give testimony to a House committee in last May and June, and I took the information that every zip code in the state of Michigan had at least one retiree in it. And that was only for the state of Michigan. We've got retirees all over the country and in several foreign countries that they've moved. Many have moved back to their homeland, retired from the city of Detroit. So when you look at, it's a small ripple effect, but it is a ripple effect. It wasn't just the city of Detroit. It was going to have an impact, and has had an impact, on the state of Michigan.
You know, so I'll give you the opinion of the judge since he's not here. I can speak for him.
Well, he's going to be Judge Rhodes.
That's right. Judge Stephen Rhodes, as several panelists have mentioned, was the person appointed to be the judge in charge of Detroit's bankruptcy, and he was more or less unknown to the broader public before this process started, because he handled mostly corporate bankruptcies and individual bankruptcies in Detroit for about 30 years until he became in charge of this process and obviously vaulted onto the national stage. His opinion is that democracy was suspended in Detroit for 18 months, but that was constitutional, because that the state of Michigan is still in control of the city of Detroit, and the city of Detroit is a subsidiary of the state of Michigan. That's what he told Judge Rhodes told me a few weeks ago when I interviewed him after he retired. So he has that's his perspective on the case. But I think democracy is a fundamental question that you have to consider, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in terms of how it affected the case itself. But let's talk a little bit more about rights and about pension rights. And the state of Michigan's constitution, like many constitutions in state constitutions in the United States, says that a pension cannot be cut, that it's a contract that cannot be cut. This became a significant issue in the bankruptcy, because what does that mean from a legal perspective? What does that mean from a human perspective, that a pension cannot be cut? The city of Detroit had about 32,000 people collecting a pension check. That was about 22,000 retirees, and then 8,000 or so folks who have earned one already but are still working for the city, and then a couple thousand people who've inherited a check from someone else, something like that. But the point is that many people's rights were at stake here. And so when Kevin Orr became emergency manager of the city of Detroit, he almost immediately said that significant pension cuts would be required to help balance the city's budget. And that, of course, raised a major constitutional issue. So maybe, Ryan, you could address the pension cut issue. And you started off, and of course, Shirley, you started off fighting that pretty vigorously.
Yeah, I mean, that was the billion-dollar question at the beginning of the bankruptcy, is could the city of Detroit cut municipal pensions in the face of Article 9, Section 24, which says municipal pensions cannot be diminished or impaired. Kevin Orr did say when he first got here that they were sacrosanct. That changed, obviously, throughout the case. But essentially what Judge Rhodes decided, in his opinion, that the pensions could be cut, is the word contract. And he said that in bankruptcy, we cut contracts all the time. That's what bankruptcy court is. The issue was there's also a contracts clause of the Michigan's Constitution that is just for all contracts. there's a specific pension clause in the Constitution, which our argument is, we're not pursuing it now, that was specific enough to trump the other contracts clause, which says this is a specific type of contract. These cannot be cut by the municipalities. And this is a little bit of backstory that pensions used to be considered gratuities or gifts, so that employers, especially municipalities, could cut them at will, which is why the section was enacted, and probably why, never thinking that a city, especially the city of Detroit, would end up in bankruptcy, they used the word contract, which unfortunately came back to say, well, we can treat it like any other contract. Judge Rhodes said they can be cut. Appeals were filed to the Sixth Circuit as part of the resolution. Those have been withdrawn because 5 years of litigation and uncertainty were not in the best interest of retirees or the city of Detroit.
Shirley, I mean, you have a pension from the city of Detroit. You've dealt with thousands of people who their pensions were at stake, and their health care insurance, which Kevin Orr was also proposing cutting. Talk about that from an emotional perspective and the kind of pleas that you heard throughout the case.
It's very emotional because it was taking away their money, and the average pensioner is making less than $19,000 a year from their pension. So a 20 or 25 or 30% cut would have drastically affected their lives. Many people, older people with homes that they had paid for, would not be able to pay their taxes. Some of the younger people, they would probably have to go out and get another full-time job to help support their families. And as I tell everyone, I didn't know the people, but I could imagine that all the different situations, knowing the income levels and the ages of some of our retirees. We have a large number of retirees that are 65 and over. In fact, it's about 2/3 of the retirees. So we're talking about older people. And they're mad because the cut is only 4.5. But because of the situation with our pension, there was an error or decisions that were made previously. That's about the best way I can state them. You know what they are.
Yes,
Diminish our funding level. And because of that, you know, they looked at that number and they said, we've got to see what's wrong. And they found out what they claim was wrong. And the people that had investments in their annuity had, they said, received too much interest over a period of time. That is creating the bigger problem than the 4.5. Just 2 days ago, I listened to 5 retirees, and 4 of them said, we can live with the 4.5 because that's the actual amount of the pension cut.
4.5%.
4.5, but they have lost most of their health care, they have lost their cost of living, and they are between 2003, 2013, those that had an annuity that had it contributed, they are losing anywhere from $200 to $200,000 that I know of, and have to pay it back, either individually or in a lump sum. There are people who have lost $2,000 out of their checks. There are people that have lost $500 out of their check. They are looking at all of this as losing their pensions. And I'm trying to get them to understand, when I talk to individuals, the 4.5, yes, we are fighting the other, but the 4.5 is what you actually lost in your pension. But that's hard to understand when their money's gone.
Go ahead, Sheila.
On this annuity issue, basically piecing it all back together, this annuity system was set up, and at a few points in time, the pension boards decided to make contributions to the annuity that didn't necessarily need to be matched by retirees. So this sort of, it was basically a form of a bonus that was given to folks who were in the pension, in the system. You have full-time employees. Well, now they're saying pay it back, pay back the portion that was that was not matched, that was given freely, that literally contributed to reducing the base of the pension system. So it amounts to you have to, whatever your proportion is, you pay it back. You either pay it in a lump sum or you pay it back. It gets taken out of your check monthly. But guess what? When it's taken out of your check monthly, it's also, you're being charged 6.5% interest. So people are literally choosing between, do I take a hit in my 401k and pay it off in a lump sum and not have to pay the 6.5%, or am I going to, take a hit longer and deeper because I'm now paying back the interest for a set of decisions that got made. And I sat on the pension board for 1 year, my last year on council. It was a nightmare year. I know it's not popular when I talk about this, but I do not think that the pension boards acted in the best interest of the pensioners or the city of Detroit. It was
Well, I think that's well documented. I mean, that
Yes.
Judge Rhodes has said that pretty clearly, that the pension mismanagement did contribute to the city's financial insolvency. And so that, to the extent to which it did, that's debatable, but it certainly did contribute to some extent. Peter, do you want to weigh in on this at all?
No, I mean, you see the complexity of the issues and the people's lives that are at stake. And just as one general observation, again, I think it's important to say positive things. Getting out with only the 4.5, not minimizing the significance of their issue, is far better than I would have predicted. Right. So I think, again, sort of the notion of some of the really quite impressive things that were done through this was not just the speed, but really having less of an impact on the pensioners than I would have ever predicted at the start of the process. And I think that goes into the good work that the foundations did, the grand bargain, the people fighting for the pensioners, the smart lawyers involved. So I think people need to be congratulated for that.
So,
And Nathan, just one thing for the sake of accuracy. There are the two separate pension systems.
Sure. Yeah, good point.
Shirley's a representative of the general retirees, which is the non-uniform. There is a pension system for the police and fire retirees, and they did not get the same treatment as the general retirees. They actually had 0 cuts in their pensions and kept 45% of their cost of living allowances going forward, which was based on how the funds were funded on an actuarial basis, so they weren't having to take as many cuts as the general did, just based on the funding levels. So just to be clear on that.
no, I'm glad you said that. The police and fire retirees did not get a cut to their monthly pension. The general retirees did. That's the distinction there. I'm glad you mentioned that, Ryan. So another right, I think, and Peter kind of touched on this, and so did Sheila as well, the right that citizens have to a functioning city. Because Peter's right, the people of Detroit had no representative in the sense that a creditor maybe had a representative in this bankruptcy. You could argue that Judge Rhodes spoke up for the city at times. You can argue, if you're a supporter of Kevin Orr, that he stood in for the city, even though he doesn't live here. So you can make these arguments, but the point is that the question in Detroit is, what right do you as a citizen have to have streetlights on? What right do you have to have the police show up on time? Because these are major basic issues in the city of Detroit that still exist to this day, but some of them are being addressed. When the bankruptcy started, about 40% of the city's streetlights were out. The average police response time, that number is a little skewed. I think the best number I've seen was something like 30 minutes or so for a violent call was the average time for a response time in 2011. You may have heard 58 minutes thrown out. That's skewed. That's not the real number. But the point is, whatever the number is, it takes a long time. And sometimes they don't come if it's not a significant issue. So these are very basic things. And the question is, do you fund a city government the way it needs to be funded? Do you pay your pensions? Do you pay the banks? This was the question of Detroit's bankruptcy. And so I just want to hear maybe from Sheila and anyone who wants to jump in, how do you balance, the need to actually, for residents to have basic services versus the need to meet these promises that Sheila talked about, or that Shirley talked about, the people who were owed these things that they were not going to be paid?
I think the object lesson here is the fact of everybody kicking the can down the road and us, the city, coming up with balanced budgets, and the CAFR never being really, the annual financial report never really actually being accurate, but still getting accepted by the state, that is a real problem. Personally, from the moment there was the first discussion of the appointment of emergency manager, there were those who were running around saying, there's going to be massive civil disorder. This is just, Detroiters will never sit still for this. My position from the beginning was, average Detroiters know we are living what a non-working city feels like. We're on the front lines. This is not an abstraction. It's not a policy discussion or a PhD discussion. This is when something happens in my house, who do I call? I do not call 911 first. I call the local security company because I'm in a neighborhood that can afford it. Calling 911, you can forget it. That's day-to-day life. I think people spoke by you did not see 10,000, 15,000 people, protesting this loss of democracy. People understood that this was really, really bad, and that the people that we have all elected, myself included, to fix it, had been abject failures. It didn't happen, and that there had to be something done. So I do think the voice of the people was heard in a way that, was mediagenic, because everybody likes to go in and see the protesters, and then people's total right, absolute right, to speak their voice across the board, defend that to the death. But that was basically city workers and some immediate family members who were supporting it. It was not the average Detroiter who was paying taxes and getting virtually nothing in return.
Mm-hmm. And, so Kevin Orr, what he did was when he started the case, he said, we are going to balance the budget. We're going to cut the debt significantly, and we're going to leave enough on an annual basis to begin reinvesting in the city. So enough money to start tearing down abandoned homes. Blight is one of the city's most significant issues because it affects property values. It fosters crime. It creates more fires. It's such a drain on city resources that if you don't address that, you may not address some of the fundamental issues in Detroit beyond blight. So they said, okay, we're going to set aside money to remove some of these abandoned homes. We're going to set aside money to invest in police cars, in tasers, in basic things that the city of Detroit did not have or did not have enough of before this happened. So that was the basic premise of Kevin Orr's plan, to cut pensions, to cut retiree health care obligations, to cut some of the debt owed to the banks, and then to use whatever was left to the extent possible to pay the basic bills and then hopefully reinvest in services. And so, you talked a lot about feasibility, and that is what this was about. The judge had to say, does this plan do enough to restore basic services in the city of Detroit? Do you think it does?
My answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to come back to a rights-based frame, because I think that's critically important. We teach our law students, if you can control the frame, you control the outcome, right? And as long as I frame this as a problem of Detroit, I inherit a logic of social triage. There's no doubt, I can starve each one of you in this room long enough where you will give up your right to vote, your right to speech for food, right? And I think the absence of protest really shows the fatigue factor of living in dysfunctionality. And it is dysfunctionality, and there are multiple causes. And I don't want to I always fight single cause, diagnoses. But let me give you a simple metric. And I love the way that you framed it, Sheila, that every dollar that went to the tax base of Oakland County came out of Detroit, right? That if you look at the region, and we really do have to begin, and that's not going to happen overnight, but it's something that I call the 3 R's that we work at the Key Center. It's race, it's regionalism, and it's reconciliation. And the need to look at any issue affecting the city from the perspective of, does it honor race, and an analysis of race and an appreciation of the history of racial injustice and ongoing structural racism? Does it situate the problem in the region? And does it have aspirational goals and pragmatic steps towards reconciliation, right? Is there enough citizens? Ask anybody in Oakland County, are they going to move to Detroit and go to these schools? And you have your answer. There's not enough. There's not enough education. There's not enough lights. There's not enough security. We're living in a second-class minimal city that nobody else in the region would accept as acceptable if they had to live there, right? And if that's the benchmark, and that's the benchmark we should have as a uniform American dream, as all citizens of Michigan, we do not have sufficient services, and our rights, which should be thought of much more holistically. Right? And actually there's opportunity here. There's opportunities to think about development differently in Detroit, which would be investing in people, which would be human capacity theories of development, which would be basing rights as a critical component of development. And I think we have the chance to kind of turn some of these corners. But anybody who thinks that this is victory from a rights-based perspective or from a humanity perspective only has to look at the broader network of the region and to say, would we accept this regionally? Would people vote for it regionally? And it would not happen.
No, I definitely think that there is no argument that the city of Detroit is not a place currently that most residents in this area would want to live. I think you're absolutely correct. But I do think that there are many folks. I mean, I think the Kresge Foundation would say that the bankruptcy did at least place the city on a path toward potentially getting to services that are feasible. Is that accurately summarize your view, or?
Yeah, I think for the foundation, we have the responsibility of deciding how to invest. So my program that I lead invests about $30 million a year in the city of Detroit. And we have to consider the economic conditions, the social conditions, and the physical conditions. And then the piece that Peter's talking about is agency, is rights. One of the programs we funded has been the Citizen Detroit program that Sheila leads, that helps people really get a deeper understanding of what these issues are. So there's a lot that we can do with that money. And we have to think about it in a way that doesn't just plug a hole in city services, but tries to address some of the root causes of the failures of the city systems. So when you think of it at a systems level, you're looking at the systems that provide transportation for people. If people can't get to jobs, it doesn't matter whether there are jobs in their region, if they can't reach them. You have to look at whether the jobs that are available in proximity to people are jobs that are going to be accessible to them from a skills level, and that will be accessible to them from transit, but also be living wage jobs. You know, can they support a family on this wage? I think there's a movement now in Detroit. We've had a lot of arguments here in the last few years about kind of the community benefits model, where big investments in the city really should be tied to an investment in the people and in the neighborhood. And I actually think we're making some progress on that argument right now. So we funded a project 6 years ago called Doing Development Differently in Detroit, to think about how that could work, to have big investors sign an agreement that some of the investment would reach people who are either harmed by the project that's being built or just not served by it. And 6 years ago, it didn't really gain much traction, but it is gaining traction now. So the whole idea that whatever investments we make need to create jobs for people, and then we need to have the kind of pipelines of training to make sure that people can take those jobs and hold those jobs, the transportation systems that are needed, the child care for women with children or men with children who need to go to work and make sure that their children are safe. That's the whole suite of activities in which the foundation I work for is trying to make a difference. So we've got investments in a rail line on Woodward that was intended to be the catalyst for a better transit system, and we now are working to try to advance the regional transit authority that can solve the problem at the regional level, as Peter mentioned. We're investing in early childhood education. We've been investing in workforce development, in economic growth. We invested in a project to try to identify the areas of economic growth that actually could serve current residents and help them form a bridge to the kind of generational change that is required sometimes. So it's that bigger frame that I think we can't take our eyes off of. To me, what the bankruptcy really did was give us a chance to focus on that and stop focusing on the decline. Without a stronger tax base, though, we won't be able to do all the investments that are called for in the plan of adjustment. Some of that is based on savings, and some of it is based on growth of the tax base. And so you have to have more residents who are employed. You have to have more property that has a higher value. Our property values fell here very drastically over the last 6, 7 years. So those are the fundamentals of rebuilding that I think we all have to focus on collectively. Now, there's not one institution that can do that by itself. But when we all work together and develop the kind of systems level approaches and collective action, we will be able to make a difference.
Sheila?
Yeah, I think both Peter and Laura have made two really important points. One is race is the 900-pound elephant in the room in southeastern Michigan. Neither the city nor the region is going to reach its full potential until we address what it is and how it is we have become one of the most residentially, racially segregated regions in the country.
Right.
How did that happen? There's a specific set of history that we just, I mean, the Ku Klux Klan played a major role in Detroit politics in the 1920s. How many people really know that who live here? There's a set of racist traditions that have been part of the culture that has left the city and went to the suburbs, went along to the suburbs. So I think that's a really, really central issue that we're just, I think, now beginning. I think the 50th anniversary of the 1967 rebellion, I call it a rebellion, it was not a race riot. We had that in 1865, in 1943, in 1967 we had a rebellion against two things: police misconduct, violence and brutality, and lack of economic opportunity. That's what drove what happened in the streets of the city and drove the police response. It's a chance to maybe start that conversation. The other thing is, you know, we just had this incident here where this man was walking 21 miles to work. And, you know, people from all over the world contributed for Mr. Robinson to get a car. When are we gonna have the conversation about how come it's okay in this region for a city to opt out of the regional transportation system? What? Part of that walk is because Rochester Hills isn't in SMART. How do we get to do that? What does the political and social culture of this region permit it to be possible for somebody to say, I've heard this from politicians I know up the Woodward Corridor, why people are freaked out about there being the bus rapid transit going north. There are in 15, there are people who live along the Woodward Corridor whose grandparents or parents grew up in this city who do not want reliable transportation moving from the city to the suburbs because they don't want people who don't look like them having that much access into their cities. That has got to be addressed. That is a regional, and ultimately the economy of this region, to Peter's point, it is a regional economy. There is no ability to rebuild Detroit's economy within the confines of the 137 square miles, in my view. It just won't happen. We can take a stab at it, and we can play a critical role, but it's a regional economy.
In about 10 minutes, maybe a little less, we're going to take questions. So if you have any questions for the panel, for myself, get those ready. Think about those. And actually, just one quick point on that. Kevin Orr, who was the emergency manager and is African American, told me a few weeks ago that he was very surprised by the level of racial tension in the city when he came here, which I find very interesting. I think speaks to the issue that may reflect some level of naivete on his part, but also sure, but also I think is a reflection of he's from Washington D.C. and talked about how he doesn't feel like they have all the same issues, although some of the same racial issues there. So you're right. I think that issue is definitely unique to us in many ways. Let's just transition very quickly. I promise I want to talk a little bit about this. The Detroit Institute of Arts, which is located steps from where we're sitting here today, is owned by the city of Detroit. This is sort of a quirk of history. It's the Detroit Museum of Art was created in the late 1800s by some wealthy folks who lived in Detroit. They wanted a museum in the cities. They created a museum with their own money, and they got art, and they put it in this wonderful building that no longer exists. In the 1910s, during World War I, the Michigan Supreme Court said, yeah, sorry, the city, you can't keep giving money to them. Because the city was giving money to this art institute to prop them up. And they said, you can't do that anymore because it's not part of the city. So they made it part of the city. The Detroit Museum of Art became owned by the city of Detroit. And 90 years later, or well, do the math, actually 100 years later, sorry, 100 years later, this became a big issue in Detroit because the city owned the museum. This is phenomenally interesting in many ways, but also very disturbing to many folks in this city because the Detroit Institute of Arts is a world-class museum, as I hope you'll see later today. It has Van Goghs, Rembrandts, Monets, Matisse, a wonderful Diego Rivera murals. These are really world-class pieces of art that are worth lots of money. And that is why this was a problem, because the creditors in Detroit's bankruptcy immediately seized upon this and realized this was a potential source to get paid back. That included both the retirees and also the banks at one point. We're all looking at the art as a potential source of money. So maybe, Ryan, you could talk about that. In the first half of the case, the retirees were not necessarily ruling out the possibility of trying to pursue a sale of the DIA art.
Well, that's true. I don't think anyone at their core wanted a sale of the DIA, and under legal precedent, I don't think that a sale could have been forced by Judge Rhodes under the bankruptcy rules, but it was a glimmering beacon of what everyone perceived as a pile of cash sitting in the middle of the city that everyone wanted to put their hands in. And it just under Chapter 9, that's not really what it was. But everyone saw it, it was shining, it was pretty, everyone wanted it. But what a lot of people don't realize is, despite the fact that there was the legislation and how it did go back to the city, a lot of the paintings and a lot of the collections were gifted by various benefactors over 100 years that may or may not have gifting restrictions on them depending on which testimony you believe from the eligibility and the confirmation trial. So it wasn't as simple as just saying, okay, we're going to sell the DIA. And Judge Rhodes had very strong concerns about that as well, because how are you going to revitalize the city of Detroit by culturally bankrupting it? And that's really what would have happened by starting to sell the DIA, because that's the first step of saying money is more important than culture. We're going to sell it at a fire sale. We'll probably get 30% of what it's worth, and where do we go from there? So that's one of the impetuses of what's now called the grand bargain in protecting the DIA and retiree pensions, because in this mythical Chapter 9 land where you can force the city to sell the DIA, which I don't think you can, that would have been put all into a pot, and retirees would have gotten their pro rata share of that pot, whereas the grand bargain was a dedicated source of funds specifically for pensions. So I think that was how both the pensioners and the DIA came allies and also protected the DIA and the cultural heart of the city.
Yeah, the grand bargain, just to give you a very brief synopsis, and I want to ask Laura about it, was basically created or mediated by Judge Gerald Rosen, who is the chief judge of the District Court of the Eastern District of Michigan here, and was basically in charge of leading all the negotiations in the bankruptcy. And he had the idea, and other folks had kernels of this idea, to raise money to help preserve the Detroit Institute of Arts, prevent a sale, and then use that money to help reduce the pension cuts that Kevin Orr was proposing for the retirees. So this is what became known as the grand bargain, because what they did was they raised donations from nonprofit foundations, including the Kresge Foundation, which donated $100 million to the grand bargain, and then also the Ford Foundation and many other foundations that ultimately pooled their money, along with the state of Michigan, which contributed $195 million, and then also donors to the Detroit Institute of Arts pledged $100 million. Altogether, about $816 million to basically offset some of the pension cuts. Didn't eliminate the pension cuts altogether, but made them a lot lower than they would have been. So that is what you may have heard of as the grand bargain. And basically what happened was the retirees agreed to support this. And so we'll get to Shirley in a second, because I want to ask about why retirees decided to support this. But Laura, you had the Kresge Foundation played a critical role in leading the grand bargain and fundamentally, getting all these people to the table. Talk about why that was critical.
Well, as I said earlier, we were all fearful about the future of Detroit if the bankruptcy wasn't resolved quickly. And that's back to Ryan's point about how long and dragged out the process could have become if the art issue had been disputed. We already heard that the pension issue could have been disputed as well. So thinking about the length of time in which the bankruptcy could have gone on and on and on with no ability to reinvest in the city, which actually is to Sheila's point that disinvestment has been the problem in Detroit, or at least one of the big ones. We were very, very worried that this city would lose its chance to come back. And so we weren't really sure how to engage with that problem. We were asked by the DIA to kind of step in and help them assemble some money to buy the art, so to speak. We were not approached by the pensioners. I think there probably wasn't a sense that charitable foundations would engage in that kind of a public sector issue.
That was unprecedented.
As pension provision. Mm-hmm. But most of us were funders of the DIA, so I think they kind of naturally came to us. But we looked at that, and the issue of the art alone was not enough to trigger that response. We have a lot of responsibilities in the community, as I said earlier, and we just didn't see that as our role. But when it came to the point where there was this three-part solution of, or three objectives of speed, art, and pensions, it suddenly was able to fall into place. And that really did originate with Judge Gerald Rosen. And one of the points I wanted to make is that I met a number of times through that process with members of the mediation team, and the mediation team were some of the finest people I ever met. I don't know if that was your experience with them, but they cared about the city very deeply, and in some ways they were looking out for the interests of residents. They may not have been appointed for that explicitly, but they really were looking out for the interests of residents. And so they were able to propose something to us that made it feasible, and it was a 20-year time horizon. We would not have been able to assemble $816 million had we had to do it in a typical foundation time. We usually make our grants for 3 years. Occasionally we'll make a grant for 5 years. And the reason for that is that we only have the stewardship of this pool of money for a period of time, and we don't want to commit so far out that we tie the hands of our successors. So it's kind of a practice that you generally would make a commitment for the period of time while you have the stewardship of the funds. In this case, all the foundations made an exception to that. They felt that this issue was so important that they would make 20-year commitments. And once we figured out how to do those 20-year commitments, it meant that we could pay it over 20 years and still continue to do the other things in the community that we needed to do. I think we would not have been able to do it if we'd had to pay out 800, or our share was 366 million. Mm-hmm. If the foundations had to do that over 5 years, it would have meant that all the other investments we were making in Detroit, and for us, other investments in other parts of the country, would have had to be reduced. And we just didn't feel that our founder would have wanted that. I mean, we always try to stay true to the wishes of the person who actually left the money for the benefit of the community, as well as the boards of trustees who govern what we do. So that was one critical point, Nathan, is that ability to pay it over 20 years. And then the ability to put some conditions on the grant so that there would be oversight to make sure that the money was well used for the pensions and that it did only go for the pensions. Some of the debt creditors were not happy about that. But because it was a voluntary gift from charitable foundations, we were able to put that restriction on it. So, we did it probably with the sense that there might be a 25% chance of success. And then things went along, and when the retirees voted in July, there was celebration throughout all of our foundations.
That's what I want to ask about now. This would be my last question before we go to questions from you folks. And Shirley, you had to decide to vote yes or no on this on these cuts, because in bankruptcy, creditors get a chance to vote a yes or no on the plan of adjustment. And so in this case, retirees were given the right to vote yes or no. If they voted no, the money goes away, and you take your chances with an appeal. If you vote yes, you get a 4.5% cut plus an additional cut if you got an annuity bonus over the last decade, and you also get health care cuts. So talk to me about that decision, whether to vote yes or no.
Well, for me, it was not, it was very clear. But I must say that those who didn't have the opportunity to sit in the courtroom and hear all the testimony from all areas missed the chance to really understand this bankruptcy, because it took all of those proceedings for you to understand what was going on. And when Judge Rosen had his vision and came up with all of this, it was phenomenal, because from that point on, when he became the person that was in charge of the mediators, you're talking about a general. I mean, he didn't care what time of day, what time of night. He would call meetings at 7 o'clock. He'd have them going to different cities. And whatever was needed was done. And that's, I can say that the 75%, a little more than 75% of the people that voted for it, because we tried, and that's what this poster is and these buttons, we tried to impress upon them that what was coming was worse than the 4.5. Even if we hadn't gotten the 4.5, and some of them don't understand yet, the health care was gone, the cost of living was gone, and the clawback, which was the excess interest earnings, they were going to get that anyway. But everything else had been taken away. And that had nothing to do with the 4.5 as far as I was concerned when I saw it. So when I saw that 4.5 and how it would affect all of our pensioners, because we've got pensioners, beneficiaries who are getting small pensions, or people who, like me, retired 30, 40 years ago, who have pensions that aren't what the pensions are today. And that's the $19,000 pension, because these people are way below that. Mm-hmm. And I knew what the impact was going to be on them if we didn't take that 4.5, because the rest of it was going to happen anyway. So there really wasn't anything, any other vote or any other recommendation we could do. And like I tell everybody, thank you for Judge Rosen, because I look at it as his vision that he had, because one day it was there and the next day it wasn't. So I mean, one day it wasn't there and the next day it was, his vision. So he really turned everything around.
And your catchphrase on your button was?
You can't eat principles, and uncertainty doesn't pay the bills. And many people don't understand what this means. You can't eat principles if you had voted no and had as much taken away from you that would have been taken away. That was what, Mm-hmm. And I must say, the uncertainty doesn't pay the bills. I'm getting credit for all of this. That's his statement. Mine is, you can't eat principles. And we'd be in meetings or we'd be sitting somewhere and I'd be just going off, you can't eat principles. Don't they understand? If you don't have money, so you're going to fight. They're still going to take the money away. They're going to fight for 3 or 4 years in the Supreme Court, if it gets to the Supreme Court, but they're still going to take the money away now. So how are you going to survive? That's how that happened. But I'll have to give him credit, because for 2 or 3 months or more, when is this, since last year, I've been getting credit for this, and all of this is not mine, okay? So I want to let you know. And also, I want to say this in front of everybody. This is a young man, and I'm going to tell your age, that is 33 years old. When he started at 32, he is the youngest lawyer that was in that bankruptcy. He was phenomenal. I mean, I have told him, I probably won't be here to see it, but he is going to do great things in his life, because he's a special attorney with a heart. He understands what has to be done legally, but he also understands how people are feeling and takes that into consideration. So I just want to give him credit, because he is the best attorney for bankruptcy or anything else, as far as I'm concerned.
Well,
and that's his mom back there, so I know.
I didn't pay her. Right? Well, I think, you can't eat principles, I think, is a fascinating phrase for you to walk away with from a citizenship perspective, what does that mean for your world? And I think it encapsulates sort of the way the bankruptcy ended, which is retirees made a compromise, retirees sacrificed for the future of the city of Detroit, which I think is something we did not envision happening at the beginning of the case. Foundations sacrificed for the city of Detroit by putting money in that they could have potentially spent elsewhere. And even the banks in the end sacrificed, perhaps to their dismay. In fact, if they were here, what they would say is, and I think there's probably a good reason they're not here, which is that they're still very angry about the way this ended. And I think you should know that although there are critics who believe that Kevin Orr was basically in the back pocket of the banks, the reality is I can testify to you personally that the banks are very upset by what happened here because they believe pensioners were put before the typical financial bonds you would expect out of a municipality. So it's just interesting to see the way this ended up. The case started with retirees fighting the bankruptcy and ended with the banks fighting the bankruptcy. So it's a very interesting way ended up occurring. So let's just maybe a couple questions. I have a few minutes here. Yeah, go ahead, right there.
So I just want to thank everybody on the panel and Nathan. Every single role sounds like an extremely difficult role to have played in bankruptcy, and especially Shirley, there was no good choice, right? You weren't given any good choices. I'm probably pretty loud without this, but I don't want us to walk away feeling too celebratory or happy about what happened. And I think that there are three really important problems that I see with this conversation in terms of framing, and I'm hoping that maybe Professor Hammer can speak to these a little bit. And the first is that of inevitability, right? A lot of things have been said about how it's a sinking Titanic, and this is going to happen, and it's either, revolution, we change everything, or we have to go through this bankruptcy. And I think that what's been overlooked in that conversation is an attention to the state's role in the creation of a fiscal crisis in Detroit, and how the fiscal crisis was indeed not inevitable, right? There has been population loss and disinvestment, but this has all been related to federal policy, state withholding of revenue sharing. Perhaps Ms. Cockrel can speak about that. There's a long history of the state withholding millions and millions of dollars from Detroit. And then that gets into the next issue of subsidies. I think that, Laura, your framing of federal and state assistance as a subsidy, I think, is a little bit historically inaccurate, because there was never a time when Detroit was not the recipient of, well, there was a time, but let's say in the 20th century, to frame federal and state funding for cities as a subsidy, I think, is a neoliberal framing that sort of suggests that there was a time when, or that there should be a time when the city is completely and wholly independent. And so I just want to kind of question that. And then I think the
I meant a specific kind of subsidy, so I'll respond to that when the time comes.
Definitely. And then I think the other framing issue, and it's not necessarily a problem in the conversation, but it's something I've been trying to think through in my own work, is that of agency. So there's a lot of scholarship now on agency in Detroit neighborhoods, and on people sort of stepping up and taking control. But I kind of want to get back to a discussion of agency at the top. And this gets to my question about the state's role in Detroit's fiscal crisis, and Ms. Cockrel mentioning the capitalists involved, and all the different players, the mayors, the mismanagement, all the different things that have happened. I think that that's sort of gotten lost in this rush to attribute structural causes for decline, which definitely exists, globalization, like all these things have impacted Detroit, but there have also been a lot of key decisions made along the way. So. Maybe if you could all respond to that.
Maybe you could share a quick thought each of you could share a quick thought here in response to that, so we can also get it to some of the folks, but those are good questions.
It's hard to respond quickly to those three, but
well, inevitability. I mean, he talked a lot about inevitability.
Quickly, the notion is what you're asking us in a very important way is to say, what is community, and what obligations do we have for each other? And as I said before, this notion of the Detroit in isolation and these sort of imaginary boundaries are really pushing to say the region has responsibility, the state has responsibility, the federal government, and you can look at the ways in which each one of those actors has abdicated his responsibility and co-contributed to the crisis here, and that we play a blame game, and that blame game is highly racialized. right? And so I have a different conversation where I have sort of connecting the dots, which really says the root cause of most of these financial issues is a convergence of 100 years of structural racism and 40 years of fiscal austerity, starting with Ronald Reagan. And every president since Reagan has been a Reaganite with respect to city policy. So your notion to say, let's look at it in a bigger frame, I think is a welcome one. I think that leads to this bigger question of who is community and what obligations we have to each other, which is an equally important, if not more important, moving forward in how we redefine the region and redefine the city.
We should also just say really quickly, I want to just jump in there since you mentioned Reagan also, that, and you're right that the state of Michigan has substantially decreased the amount of money it's given to the city of Detroit. That's called state revenue sharing. Over the last 10 years or so, 15 years, they also sort of reneged on an agreement to give the city a lot of money. We're not going to get into that. But I think it's worth noting also that the Obama administration didn't really do much also for the city of Detroit through this process. They freed up a little money here or there to tear down some homes, but there was no bailout for the city of Detroit like there was for General Motors and Chrysler. So, this is almost in some ways a bipartisan failure, I think. It's not really a political, in a lot of ways it goes to both parties.
Right, who's the last president that had an urban policy?
Mm-hmm.
Or governor that's had an urban policy, an urban agenda? It just doesn't exist. But I think to the point about the role of the state, absolutely, the state government for the last 50 years they call local units of government LUGs. Any state budgetary problem would be looked at as take something from the LUGs. It's a series of unfunded mandates. It goes across departments of all kinds of services. There has to be a brand new model for funding local services from the state level, a different set of requirements. I do think, I've heard rumblings that the governor understands that it's time to have a different conversation, because whether it's a city in bankruptcy or under emergency management or, with lots of cash on hand, it doesn't matter. The state's approach is not one that helps provide reliable, stable services. And that ought to be, it seems to me, an absolutely core function of state government, because everybody is a creature of state government. It's the federal government and the states, and everybody else, falls up under, whether you're a county, a city, a village, or a township. So I think that's a good point, and that's a conversation I think is a 2016, 17, and 18 conversation in the state of Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And as I do represent a foundation which is not allowed by law to take a political stance, I agree personally with many of these discussions about the cause of the problem, with Peter's statement, with Sheila's statement. I guess from my perspective, we have to look at the political reality of today and try to do the best we can in the current circumstances. So whether we'll be able to change society so that it exhibits more caring for each other, even if we can do that or we can't do that, we have to try to reinvest in the city, and that's our role. When I use the term, just for clarity, when I use the term subsidy, it's talking about market forces that are at play that won't allow financing to be secured to build the kind of physical redevelopment that's required. So there's a gap there because the market value of the land won't, it doesn't generate the kind of lending that you need to have. So right now, the subsidies are huge to build a unit of housing, and we have to get to a point where the market is stronger so that people can actually secure the financing to rebuild.
So how about just two quick more questions, and then we'll yes, sir.
My question comes from a view of Kevin Orr as sort of a Batman figure, and I know that sounds silly, as kind of a Dark Knight figure. In the recent movies, he's kind of the figure who is outside of the law. He has a complicated relationship with the normal functionings of Gotham government, but he's the guy that can be the bad guy, get done what needs to get done in the end, and at the end he can ride off. And so I guess for Ms. Lightsey and Mr. Plecha, who are contestants, if you want to call it, in the bankruptcy who were parties. To what extent was Mr. Orr a partner with you, or an enemy, an adversary? And how was he? How good was he as a partner or an adversary? And I think my other question also has to do with that, because at the end of the Batman movies, Batman goes off and he's in good shape or in a bad shape, but the city is better for him. And now we have a new energetic mayor. We have a city council that is harmonious within themselves and with the mayor. And I guess this is for all panelists. To what extent do you think that is a result of the bankruptcy, of the emergency manager, of the suspension of normal city operations, and the bankruptcy? Thank you.
Well,
Brian and Shirley.
the emergency manager came into the city of Detroit, and as I've stated to others, and he's heard it too, I said the Indians were scouts. During the war, they had scouts that went out before the troops got there, and my recommendation is send a scout out to the next city, because I didn't feel that he had the feeling of the city. And Detroit has its own culture and its own feeling. We're not New York, we're not California, we're Detroit. We are the manufacturing, as I said, and proud of who we are. And he was, to me, and like I said, I told him this, to me he was very cold and insensitive, and said things that alienated people before they really understood what was going on. He began to see the difference and was changing. I don't know if that's true or, if he really changed or not, but the way he approached the situations was a little less inflammatory. When he came in, we were ready to fight. After we saw all the facts, we had to take the best deal. So it wasn't that we were in love with Kevin Orr or anyone else. We had to do what was best for the retirees. So he knew that, as I said, because I told him we had to do what we had to do. It wasn't because of anything that he did, but we had to look at the facts. And the facts said, take the best deal for your people.
Sheila, real quick. You were going to say something?
No, I was.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
The second question, what was a second part of the question?
To what extent do you think the fact that
Yes.
City Hall is working well now?
Yeah.
I think
Good
that,
question.
I think that it's taking nothing away from a very energetic mayor who has a vision and has has a capacity for managing structural change, and a council that's different. I think the fact that there is a financial review commission that is in place and will be in place at a minimum until 2018 is really critical. And some folks may not like it. I'm personally glad it's there, because at the end of the day, we need to be clear here where we're getting the money to fix the services. That isn't going to come from savings and fee collection, is coming from the sale of a bond. I've seen this happen. You sell a bond, and for the next 10 years, you only pay the interest portion of the bond. This is the strategy to create what was at one time going to be $100 million and may now be somewhere between 27 and 50 million, to start rebuilding the service delivery system, which is, the mayor's working very hard on it. It has a very talented team, but it is still a fundamentally broken system.
Peter, real quick.
Yeah, I think you always, at least I try to think about approaching people with assuming that they're sincere and based on goodwill, and you try to wish them well. So as the mayor, the city council, or others, I think we want all of them to be successful. But you also want to sort of raise concerns, right? So I have a concern whether or not everybody in Detroit is going to benefit from the new development, and I think we have to fight to make sure people benefit from it. I have a desire that we start putting people at the center of development and not property at the center of development is one of our core values moving forward. And I have a real dystopian fear that we have set into place a series of tectonic plates that could threaten to displace 40 or 50% of our current residents, and those are the people who are living at or below the poverty line, because there's nothing in the current social policy that is going to provide for them. And those, for me, as we're sort of thinking about the ship of state moving forward, are some of the things I think we have to be concerned about.
How about one more question? Yes, in that back there. Yeah.
My question is, what does Detroit's comeback look like? Shirley noted that manufacturing continues to be a key part of Detroit's identity. Is that a sort of a realistic starting point for a comeback? We heard in an earlier panel today the ubiquity of the idea of shrinking the city. Is Detroit's comeback going to look like a smaller Detroit? Is it going to look like a differently organized city? What is that going to look like?
Yeah, the sheer size of the city is a significant issue that does affect the city's ability to deliver services. And Laura, the Kresge Foundation is invested in the Detroit Future City Project. Talk a little bit about that.
The Detroit Future City project looks for alternative uses for vacant land that can be productive uses. That's one of the key areas of focus in that framework, to help people make decisions about what to do with vacant land and turn vacant land into more of an asset than a liability. People think of it now as a liability. So there are some really interesting ways to think about the future economy related to food, related to energy production, localization of the economy that can come about because we have that land. I don't think that's going to be the whole of what happens, but when you think about nationwide, there's much more interest in fresh food, in healthy food that's grown locally. And Detroit is very well positioned for that. The state itself is one of the second, I think it's the second or third largest agricultural producer in the country, and Detroit has strong assets around that, community gardens, people who are experts at agriculture. We have one of the best agriculture schools in the country here in the state. So that's one area that we can focus on. The Detroit Future City project also identified the types of industries that can come here. They identified that the core problem of the economy is that there's only 1.9 jobs for every 4 residents. Well, no, that's not right. Our rate of job per resident of the city is less than half the next highest in the country. So it goes back to that issue of jobs flowing outside the city. I mean, you can look at globalization, that's part of it, but a lot of it really was jobs moving to the suburbs and the exurbs. So how do we kind of restore that growth to the city? And then it also looks at city systems like transit, like water, and thinks about how to improve those systems over time. So, hopefully those ideas are gaining some traction. I think they are. I've seen evidence of the federal government wanting to invest in some stormwater issues so that we don't have to replace our whole stormwater system. If that happens, jobs will come. The construction that is taking place in the city now is focusing more on what does that mean in terms of jobs. The rail line that I mentioned earlier has an explicit goal of 30% of the jobs that are going to local residents, people of color, and minority-owned businesses. So things like that are starting to pick up traction. We're certainly not there yet, but those ideas are in the mix and I think show a lot of promise.
Give the last word to Shirley.
I just wanted to say, when she mentioned that, if we don't train the youth in the city of Detroit, because we have different generations, and we have 2 generations, I think, about 2 generations that really haven't had a lot of technical or manufacturing training and training in the areas that we're going to need. So without the proper schools, which is another problem, we will not have the citizens of the city of Detroit working those jobs. Right. You can go out here right now and look at this rail system that's going on, and you probably have to do the whole rail system before you'll see a minority working. I don't know if it's they couldn't find the workers that were qualified or they just didn't hire them. I don't know, and I haven't investigated it. I just say, well, business is as usual. So, Peter, he's right. There are some institutional racism issues that have to be resolved so that we can start at the very basic of having people trained to take the jobs that will be here in the city. I think the city, in a year's time, and being downtown in the courts and having to go from restaurant to restaurant and wherever, whatever, we were able to feel the growth, the vibrancy of the new, younger professionals coming into the city of Detroit. The magic to all of this is going to be, how do we get that to spread out into the city? Because there are areas that they could spread out to, but without the proper schools, without the proper safety, without the proper trash pickup, without all of the things that are needed for a city, without them being in place, you know, it won't happen. So yes, there are many things that need to be worked on right now so that we will, 10 years from now, be ready for whatever growth is coming. And I see a lack of training, I really do. And I think that's very important. I don't mean from the elementary level, I mean for those who are in high school and getting ready to go out and be able to work. And because without them, renting apartments or buying houses or buying food or whatever, if they stay in Detroit, there won't be any growth. And that's my fear.
Well, it's been a great panel discussion. I know you're off to visit the Detroit Institute of Arts, I believe, some of you at least after this, and I challenge you to walk through the halls of that museum and ask yourself, what would you have done with the museum on the line and the pensions potentially being cut and the city services also struggling, you know? And, you know, about a year ago today, there were appraisers walking through the halls of the Detroit Institute of Arts, literally looking at each piece and assessing how much they were worth. And you know, depending on who you ask, the museum is worth anywhere from $1 to $8 billion, and we'll never know because the museum is permanently protected from a sale. So I want to thank the panel for this opportunity, also for to the Wayne State folks, and you have some specific instructions as well, I believe, for the people.
The specific instructions are a round of applause for our panelists and moderator.